but this is the first time we've had a talk about sport and meditation. Just the idea of how they connect, how meditation helps sport, and how sport can help meditation. So it's great to see you all here. We have a very special guest, actually a friend as well, Karteek Clark, all the way from Edinburgh. And he has done some remarkable achievements. He's been meditating for many years, I think 25 years or something like that, yeah. But he's also, as you can see from the poster, he's swum the channel 11 times successfully. So it's quite remarkable. And he spends more time in the water than on land, is that right? Yeah. And he's also done ultra-distance running, 6-day races, 10-day races. So he'll be sharing all his experience, his story, his journey, and how meditation has helped him along the way, and how he's used meditation as a tool to really help him achieve some of these remarkable sporting achievements. So welcome to Karteek, and it's good to see you all here, and hope you enjoy it.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. I know it's a very cold evening. I'm surprised to see so many faces here. So as my colleague said, I want to talk to you this evening about my experiences. I've been fortunate enough to be involved in channel swims and some multi-day races, but I also want to try and look at it from the angle of meditation. And really that's how I was inspired and how I got the strength and energy to do it. But it all started with the English Channel. And here we have someone who is getting ready to swim the Channel. And whenever I talked about the Channel, I mentioned something about the Channel, people would say, oh, that's the thing where you cover yourself in that duck grease, isn't it? And here you can see this gentleman indeed being covered in duck grease. Actually, it's a bit of a thing of the past. People don't really do that anymore. Scientifically, it blocks up your pores, and it doesn't actually really keep you that warm. But people, that's the only thing people would ever say to me. They say, oh, you cover yourself in that grease. So I'm hoping that partly today I will dispel the myth that you don't actually cover yourself in grease anymore. I'm not quite sure if he's enjoying himself or not there. He's probably contemplating what's going to happen for the next 10 or 20 hours. So, for those of you who don't know, there's the Channel sitting right there. Looks suspiciously short. It is actually 21 miles, which is about 34 kilometers. The thing is, you actually end up swimming a little bit further due to the power of the tides. And that can vary quite a lot. The tides go in a cycle, and some weeks are actually a lot more powerful than others. So you can actually end up swimming something like that. So you can see your water track can actually end up being a lot longer than the 21 miles. So anyway, there is someone waiting to swim across the Channel, and they're standing on Shakespeare Beach, which is just next to Dover. It's about a mile to the west of Dover, and that's really where all the swims start from. Rather a god-forsaken place. Nothing much happens there apart from a few unlikely people that do swim across the Channel. You see a few fishermen there and a few bits of rubbish and things that get washed up. But that's where you start from. The other thing you do is you have a boat with you. Sometimes people ask me, so do you just swim across on your own, or do you have an accompaniment? And you do, you swim along with a boat. And that would be a typical kind of boat. In the olden days, it was mainly the fishermen who would accompany channel swimmers. But now more and more people are doing it, and you see some slightly smarter looking. Occasionally, I don't know if you can see up in the corner there's a little fin appearing. People often ask me about this. They say, well, aren't there sharks and things? We're pretty fortunate in the UK that we don't have any man-eating sharks, or there's no real record of them. So there's some stories of them, obviously. Stories grow up everywhere. But you do get dolphins appearing from time to time, and even seals. I've had a seal sometimes appear in the middle of the Channel, and you think, that's just not fair. It's far too easy for that seal. You can swim out, get some fish, and go back in. When I've been training, I've had nice experiences with dolphins appearing, and sometimes seals. Initially, that can be quite frightening, but it's also quite an interesting experience when you think about it afterwards. But he's been fortunate enough, I think, to have a dolphin there accompanying him. So when you start to get towards the other side, you might have a nice view like that. Those are the White Cliffs of France, funny enough. You can see they don't look that much different from the British White Cliffs. I'm sure they're proud of their cliffs. The actual shortest point is just here, and that's called Cap Greenet. You may have heard of that. And that's the shortest point from Dover across to France. Because of the tides, it's actually very difficult to stop on that spot. my colleague said that I've done this 11 times, and I've never managed to finish on this point here due to the tides. I always usually finish in here, or sometimes even further up here. And one time I even finished almost in Calais. The time I finished in Calais was actually the last swim I did, which took me 19 hours. And I started off, and I don't think I had my watch with me, but I knew that I'd started about 4 in the morning or so. We kept swimming, and then I noticed the sun was going down. I thought, okay, so it must be 10 or 11 at night. And I thought I could see the beach quite near me. And you do see the land in front of you, but when you're swimming, it looks a lot nearer than it really is. And my helpers weren't giving me any drinks or anything to eat. I thought, well, that's great. They probably decided that we're so close, there's no point in stopping. About 8 hours later, the sun started coming up again. And I thought, right, we must have gone all the way through to the next day here. And of course, they did start giving me more things to drink. So sometimes it can take an awful long time. That's the aerial view of Cap Brunei. And that's the point where you want to try and land, but it's very difficult to land. Sometimes you can finish during the day, it can be nice and sunny. Sometimes you finish in the middle of the night, perhaps on some rocks somewhere. One time I finished and there was, I think, a bit of a beach party going along, and lots of people came down and they congratulated me, and they even brought me champagne and things. I didn't really feel like it, but I had to be polite. Other times I finished in the middle of the night, and one time I finished and I remember there was a couple sitting on the beach quite close to where I was, and I thought, well, that's great, they'll come and have a little chat with me and congratulate me, but they just carried on what they're doing, oblivious. They had no idea that I just swam all the way there. So that was interesting. So that's kind of the channel in a nutshell, and I wanted to just tell you briefly how I've trained for it. It really starts off in the swimming pool, and I'd start off by, my idea was that I should try and go and be able to swim a mile regardless of how tired I was or what time of day it was. So even if I was tired in the evening, the swimming pool was open, I'd say, well, I should be able to at least go and swim a mile. And that'd take me about half an hour or so. I'd then build up to about a 5K swim, so it's 3 miles in the pool, and that would take me about an hour and 20 minutes, maybe on a very slow day, an hour and a half. And I would try and do that maybe 3 times a week, 4 times a week when I was really starting to build up. Occasionally then I'd try and do a longer swim in the pool, perhaps 2 hours or even 3 hours. And a couple of times I even did a 6-hour swim in the pool. And that was always an interesting experience, because you'd go in at lunchtime or something and you'd say hello to the lifeguard, and sometimes they knew what I was doing, and other people, they didn't seem to know what I was doing, and then you'd get out again, you're looking a bit tired with your goggles, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the evening, and you sort of wonder what they're thinking. But generally they didn't seem to really notice, to be honest. A couple of them would chat to me and say, you've been in there an awful long time, haven't you? So that's really how I would start with the pool. That's rather a busy swimming pool, and you get something called lane rage, which is a bit like road rage. People actually get annoyed with swimming into each other, and I'm sure any swimmers here will relate to that. But I'd recommend you not to try lane swimming in China. It gets rather busy in the swimming pools there. So, apart from the swimming, you need to somehow start trying to adjust to the cold water. And that is a little bit of an exaggeration, but that is someone who is doing some ice swimming. I would typically try and start swimming in the sea about May or June, and just try and get used to the cold. And just starting off with half an hour, maybe building up to an hour or so. But really it'd be a question of finding a lake or somewhere with some colder water. And there's me, well, it's actually not me, it's a colleague of mine swimming in the sea. But the idea would be in the sea, you start off with 1 or 2 hours, and eventually you try and get to the stage where you can swim for 6 hours in the sea. And that's always mentally very, very difficult, I found, to go and feel that you're going in for a swim, and especially it's quite cold, it's a bit windy, and you're going to be in there for 6 hours. And really, I think that's where I'd like to talk to you a little bit about meditation. How do you find the inspiration, how do you find the enthusiasm to do these things? So, I wanted to start with a little quotation from this book. I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the quotations in this book, which is Sport and Meditation by Sri Chinmay. We do have a couple of copies available there. In the foreword of the book, Olivier Bernhard, who's a Swiss triathlete, he says, "For me, sport is meditation. And he goes on to say, by becoming conscious of this inner dimension and by training it, I overcome obstacles that I could not have overcome if I trained the body only. He then goes on to say, you have to train your inner capacities with the same intensity as you train your body. So I just wanted to put that up as my kind of starting point. And it's also kind of nice because it's the beginning of this book, which I particularly admire, and it's got some very interesting ideas in it. But I'd like to just have a little bit of a look at what that really means. What are inner capacities and how do we train them? Meditation starts with this idea of something infinite or something vast. And often when you read about meditation, or if you go to a class about meditation, they'll talk about this idea of trying to enter into the vast sky, or the vastness within you, or something that's epic, something that's beyond yourself. And I think for me that would be definitely one of the starting places. I didn't actually ask if any of you do meditation or have studied meditation, but that would perhaps be my next little question before I do talk more. Have many people tried meditation or been to classes, maybe just a hand? Yeah, quite a few.
I don't now, but in the past.
You have in the past, okay, good. I imagine there'd be quite a few people who've tried. Nowadays there's so many different courses and things available. It is quite common. In the past it was more unusual, certainly. Those of you who've tried meditation will probably back me up when I say that most styles of meditation are about trying to still the mind, quieten the restless mind, and just trying to allow ourselves to enter into that more peaceful, more solid, stronger part of ourselves. And often a simple analogy like a tree or something that's blowing around in the wind. The leaves are a bit like the restless mind. And meditation enables us just to slowly enter into this stiller, firmer, more solid part of ourselves. The other thing with meditation is it's definitely about stilling and quietening the mind. And you might say that the mind is to do with analysis, to do with separation perhaps, to do with separating ourselves, viewing things from a distance. It's a lot to do with separation. Whereas when we meditate, we try to enter into this state or this part of ourselves that tends to identify more with the things around us. It tends to feel unity, to want to feel part of something bigger. Again, coming back to this idea of vastness. And I think that's why, and I'm sure some of you have had this experience, where you look at a mountain, or you look at a sea or the lake, and you just think, I just want to be in that. I want to swim in it, I want to climb it. Somehow I just want to be with it. And I think that's coming from just a natural tendency we have to want to meditate and go beyond perhaps the confines of the mind. So I think for me that's where I'd say it starts, that idea of an inspiration to want to do these things. Closely linked to meditation, I think, is this idea of perhaps being able to develop our inner determination, perhaps our self-confidence, some of these inner, slightly more abstract things. And I think that's what the quote meant when he talked about developing our inner capacities. I think these are slightly more intangible things that we all have within, things like determination, willpower, self-confidence, all these kinds of things. But rather than just being like an abstract term, when we go out to the marathon, we say, right, I'm determined, I'm going to do well, I'm determined, I'm feeling confident. I think meditation enables us to slowly develop these things inside us. So determination becomes almost like an entity. It has its own kind of existence. And it's just like a muscle that we can slowly build and slowly develop. Self-confidence, willpower. Instead of just being a mental idea, this is actually a reality. It's something we can enter into and slowly try and develop. So I think that's another thing that for me would be important with meditation. Often meditation is thought of as being rather passive kind of activity. But here's a nice quote from Sri Chinmoy where he talks about the inner dynamism of meditation, just how powerful and active a thing it is. So although you're quite still and you're going into this still part of yourselves, it's actually full of energy, and that's something we then can express through these sports. And as a gentleman was saying, I don't think it needs to be challenging yourself to do a channel swim or to climb Mount Everest. It can be just going out for a swim with a dog. I mean, it really can be something where you're just experiencing that reality. So to come back to the swimming, and how did I bring this into the swimming? Well, I think it's something that's slowly kind of seeped into my way of training. It's something that when I look back, I can see that the meditation had a very powerful effect on me. So as soon as I had to go and swim, when I had to do, for example, these 5-kilometre swims, it's 3 miles, and I'd have a very clear image of a mile. It would take me, in those days, I'm a bit slower now, but it used to take me about 27 or 28 minutes, which isn't, as you'll know, isn't particularly fast. But I would do that mile, and I'd divide it up into 4 different sections of a quarter mile, which in a 50-metre pool, as you know, is 8 times 50 metres. So I'd start off with my little 8 lengths, and then I'd know I've got another 8 lengths to do, and then I'm halfway through, and then I'd build up, and then I've done my mile. And I know I'd just be slightly under the half an hour point. And then for my second mile, the same thing would happen, and I'd have an exact image of where this thing was. And then the third mile was always just almost like a downhill, like a little finish. So already there was just this very strong sense of dividing this distance up into very manageable chunks. And sometimes even after swimming for 2 lengths, I feel my mind coming in and saying, oh, you're going to be in here for quite a while, this is a long way, 3 miles to swim, I'm sure you'd rather be doing other things. But very quickly I could just get into this idea of, right, I've just got to swim my little 8-length stretch, then I can do another one. And before I knew where I was well into this swim, and then I was into my little downhill stretch, and I'd done my 3 miles, and it was done. When I then had to double that distance to do a 10K, I would just do this 3 miles, and then, okay, I've just got to do the same thing again. And this really just started building up in my mind until with the longer swims in the sea, you'd have to actually go out and do a 6-hour swim. And I would just sometimes panic at the idea of, inside I really want to do this thing, and I'd be so keen to, for example, do this swim. As I told you, I had this burning urge to do it. I knew I had to get through some of these 6-hour swims, but inside something would say, oh, it's just too long, too difficult. And even with that, I would sometimes, for example, not look at my watch and say I was going to start at 10 o'clock. I'd waste a bit of time. So in fact, I was starting about 5 past or maybe even 10 past. But I'd know inside that I kind of cheated myself. And then somehow the first hour would go by much more quickly. It was quite easy to do the first hour. And once I'd done the first hour, I'd say to myself, well, I just got to do the same thing again. And I've done 2 hours. And usually by the time I'd swum for 2 hours, everything was fine and I could just do what I wanted. By the time I got to what I thought was about 6 hours, I'd say to myself, well, you shortchange yourself those 5 minutes, 10 minutes at the beginning. But it's very easy. You've completed your distance, just stay in the water for another 5 or 10 minutes. And that might sound strange, but it's amazing how much that little change in the mind was able to affect me. And I think, again, it comes back to this idea of meditation allowing you to make the distances and the times more malleable. Something about them, they're not fixed. It's not like this kind of iron prison sentence, if you like, of 6 hours of cold swimming. When you allow the mind just to relax a bit, somehow you can find these ways around it. And that really worked for me. So, yeah, Nisha.
Sorry, I'm so curious,
Yeah.
because this is quite an important point that you
Yeah.
raised. It sounds as though when you were kind of breaking up the portions of your swim,
Yes.
you're actually activating your conscious, analytical mind.
Yes.
At what point would you make the switch from thinking and analysing, right, I'm going to do this, and this is going to happen?
Right.
How do you, I've experienced it,
Yeah.
I love that flow state where you're alive and you're, as you beautifully described, it's not a passive thing.
Right.
Everything feels so easy, but how do you get into it?
Yes. Well, I think the dividing up bit, it's interesting because I was saying that that's a very mental process and we're trying to get out of the mind. But I think what we're trying to escape from is this rigid idea in the mind that I've got to swim for 2 hours or I've got to swim all the way from here to there. And it's just a question of inventing things that divide that distance up, that split it up in a way that then it becomes much more manageable. And then I think somehow, because you're slightly confused about the times and the distances, it just all seems to start to go into a flow. So it's almost like a way of tricking the mind, I think. And certainly doing these things, I've realized that the mind is quite open to being tricked. Your own mind. Perhaps it's a kind of self-hypnosis. I don't know. I don't know enough about it, but it's amazing. It's a bit like a very good salesman. You can talk to your mind and come up with some quite interesting ideas, and you can almost feel your mind just thinking, oh, okay, you've got a point there, and just quietening down for a bit. And slowly, I think you can get the upper hand over all these things that are bothering you. hopefully we can talk a bit more about this, but I'll press on for the time being. So I always like this quote from Sri Chinmoy: "You can easily challenge the pride of a frightening distance." And again, it comes back to what I'm trying to say, that when we enter into meditation, the distance, the goal, everything starts to have a kind of feel to it, or a material entity. So the idea of a goal, it's not a fixed thing far in the distance. It's something you can slowly, by focusing on it, start to interact with, start to have more of a relationship with. And perhaps in some ways you can start to sort of draw it closer to you. One thing I found when I do train for an event is that, for example, with the channel, I'll be just doing some general training, perhaps with a view to doing this event in a year or 6 months. But there comes a point where it's like you've started the training for the swim, and I'll go along to the swimming pool, say, and every stroke, it's somehow about swimming across the channel. It's like I've started this thing now. I've taken the first few strokes, I've done the first mile, tomorrow I'm coming back. And I found that there's almost a point where this begins in your training, where you're actually now involved with this goal. So maybe it's training for a marathon or something. It might be 6 months before. But for me, there's a point where actually now I'm actually running this marathon. And I think that's where that goal somehow has started to become meaningful for you, and you've started to enter into it. That's my own 10 cents worth. But I'd be interested to get some of your feedback on that. Okay, well, I just wanted to show you, I've talked about swimming, I just wanted to talk to you briefly about some runs that I've done. This is an event called the 6 and 10 day race, and 6-day races are becoming quite well known now around the world. The 10-day race is very unusual. This is an event that takes place in Flushing in New York every year, and it's happened for about the last 20 years or so. I was starting to get a little bit bored, let's say, with swimming. I'd had to change my diet so much. I was eating a lot of food that I think didn't help with running, and I found myself getting heavy and lethargic, and I actually found I couldn't really run anymore. 1 or 2 miles was just a real struggle. And one day I woke up and I'd read about this race, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to do this 6-day race. And it seemed to come from somewhere else, because my mind said, well, look, you can't even really do a 5K race, so how on earth are you going to do a 6-day race? And somehow, just by signing this application form and sending it off, I got this tremendous thrill. Every time I thought about it, I thought, isn't that a great idea? And then, of course, it got nearer the time. And I did start going out and training for it. I did a lot of walking, actually. I was able to walk at quite a good pace, and sometimes then I found I could lead into running. But even just to be able to get out and walk at quite a good pace was good. And I eventually did this 6 days, and it was very tough, but I really got tremendous joy and enthusiasm from doing it. And I decided that the following year I'd up to this 10-day race, which is the one that you see starting here. I put down the world record for you. It was actually just under 1,000 miles, and the women's record is 807 miles. So it just gives you some idea what the top runners are doing. They're really running this thing non-stop for 10 days. This is where the race started from back in 1986, when Sri Chinmoy inspired people to put on a 1,000-mile race. And that's where this 10-day race has grown from. And again, you can see that the very first people that did it, the record now is still 10 days and 10 hours, and it's probably a record that'll stand for a long, long time. But even the 15-day cutoff, you can see, is a very tough thing to do, and a lot of people didn't necessarily finish in the 15 days. That involves running 38 marathons. But this event that I took part in, I remember the organizer of that 1,000-mile race, he said to me that when he first put it on, people came up to him and they said, you know what, no one's ever going to be interested in running that kind of thing. He said, you've got a few die-hard ultra runners here, but no one will ever be interested. Nowadays, this has 80 competitors, and within about a month, the application has to close because they can't take any more people. So it's interesting how these things have taken off. As you can see, people, you do end up walking quite a bit, but these top runners, for example, this man, he's Danish, he did about 700 miles, and that really involves running quite a lot of the time. I think this is towards the end, so people are feeling quite happy. There's not too long to go. You get all sorts of people that come and do this race. Lowly people like me that haven't really run these things before. This is Arun Badvaj, who's an Indian ultra distance runner, one of the first Indian ultra distance runners. I think he's also run across India. This is Yolanda Holder, who did it the year I was doing it. She has the American record. I think she ran 120 marathons one year. Tanisha, those you. Again, she was just taking part in this race, and I would be walking along or running, and she would shoot past me, and she was walking, and I would be trying to run, and she'd be going about twice the speed of me, and I think she probably did about over 600 miles or so. So all sorts of different kinds of people. Here's just someone who did it for the first time, and he's just coming through his 200-mile mark. And I think you can see that people seem to be getting a lot of joy and happiness from doing this thing. And I was asking myself, why on earth would I do this? And really, I'd have to say, it just gave me so much of a thrill, so much joy and happiness. And I know people that have helped out on this race. It involves a lot of helpers, and they all seem to come to this race and just become part of this energy. And you see 30 or 40 helpers around every day, and I don't think I ever saw anyone feeling depressed or unhappy while they were there. So some kind of energy seems to come from these events. Of course, I do it mainly for the food, which is always, there's always plenty of that available, because of course you're burning up huge amounts of calories on these things. There's an amazing organisation around this race. There's tents and kitchens and helpers. It's really quite a remarkable thing to see. Okay, good. I just wanted to talk briefly about Sri Chinmoy, who's been a major inspiration for me, and is the author of the book who I took the quotes from. He's Bengali, he came to the West in 1964, and he passed away in 2007. But all that time he spent trying to encourage people to try meditation and to demonstrate what could be done with the power of meditation. He was a great runner, in fact a decathlon champion in India, in his native Bengal, where he studied in an ashram. And when he came to the US, he got interested in weightlifting, and it wasn't something that ever really appealed to him in his past, but he somehow got interested in this thing, perhaps as a means to demonstrate what could be done with this inner spirit. He started off by actually lifting people over his head. He had a special contraption, and he'd just lift people a couple of inches. I'm going to show you an image of that in a minute. And in a way it was perhaps to honour this person, but it was also just to demonstrate what could be done with meditation. So this is him meeting President Mandela, and he wanted to honour President Mandela by lifting him. There's just a very quick clip.
We have not. I hope you still recognize me. Very nice to see you. Thank you very much.
So it was just to give you an idea, and he ended up lifting, I think, over 2,000 people, often heads of state, people he particularly liked or he thought were influential in some way. He lifted these people, a lot of famous people, a lot of athletes and sportsmen. And I think just that idea of honouring them and to demonstrate what could be done. And as you can see, it's not really done in a sort of macho, trying to prove something. It's done in quite a meditative, peaceful kind of way. He went on to lift other things like planes and an elephant, for example, all sorts of little things. You just lift them a couple of inches. I think things that we find give us joy or give us happiness. I'm not sure how much happiness it gave him lifting these things, but I think it gave people a sense of interest and joy. So I just wanted to show you that. For me, I think the most amazing thing he did was lifting this weight, which is actually 7 tons. And he managed to just lift that a tiny bit with his wrist. And I had a couple of quotes that, I think, do you have a piece of paper? Yeah, I'd like to read those out. These are just a couple of quotations that Sri Chinmoy made about weightlifting and lifting, and just how he felt it came from an inner place.
We have to know that physical energy has only one source, and that source is spiritual energy. As long as we remain in the body consciousness, we are not aware of this. But when we go deep within, we see that spiritual energy is the source of physical, vital, and mental energy. When I look at the weight, I am frightened to death. But then again, when I concentrate, I am not afraid of it. I become one with it. I act like a hero. When I am not one with it, when my concentration or my oneness with the weights is not there, then I am actually frightened. But when I try to go beyond the mind, then these barriers do not exist. I am doing these lifts with the physical body, but the strength and power are coming from within, from another source. Inner strength is not my monopoly. Everybody has it, only it has to be brought forward. Physical strength in comparison to spiritual strength is nothing, absolutely nothing.
Great, thanks. So I just wanted to give you a little taste of Sri Chinmoy and how I've certainly been very inspired by his teachings and a lot of his writings. And he's taught a lot of people about meditation in the West. And I found, particularly training for these 10-day races, there's been times where things have just gone badly wrong. The training's been going great, and suddenly one day your knee is completely wrecked, or even something physical. Like I remember last year I stubbed my toe on a chair about 6 weeks before the beginning of this 10-day race, and I just actually could hardly walk on it. And I've become very curious about what's going on here. This is very much my own viewpoint, my own 10 cents. There's a lot written about this, there's a lot of scientific research on this. My own view, and I've come to the conclusion, is that often these blockages will seem to come up just when you're doing quite well in your training. And it's almost as if I've decided you've moved up a level. It's not like you've gone backwards and this random thing has come in and floored you for some reason. I've come to the conclusion that often something is happening that is to try and teach you about something. And as I said, about 6 weeks before this 10-day race, I stubbed my toe, and I think I must have started walking at a very unusual angle, because about 2 weeks later my knee was just agony, and I could really hardly walk on my knee. I certainly couldn't train anymore, and it was starting to get close to the date of this 10-day race, which is running and as much as you can for 10 days. And you really want to be in reasonable shape for that. And it was in New York, and I was due to fly to New York for something else about a week before. And of course you have a lot of equipment you take with you, and I thought, well, do I take it with me or not? And everything was saying, well, forget it. There's just no chance you can run for 10 days if you can hardly walk. But I was so keen to do this race. I'd got so much joy and happiness from it. I just couldn't bear the idea of not doing it. It was just for me. I'd been looking forward to it. I knew it was going to be really tough, but I just so much wanted to do it. I took all the stuff with me, and every day building up to this race, I'd think, well, I can't do this thing. And I'd tell my friends, look, I can hardly walk. And everyone would come up with a theory. Everyone has a theory. And some doctors I spoke to, and they were realistic, but none of them said, I don't think you can do it. People would suggest all sorts of things, all sorts of little concoctions. One person said, okay, you just got to have hot milk with turmeric every night before you go to bed, and it'll take away all the swelling. And I tried that, and nothing much happened. But actually, I think that probably is quite a good thing. In the end, I actually went to see an Ayurvedic doctor, just out of curiosity. And something about this man, I liked his approach. He had a very gentle approach, and he just said to me, you'll be fine. In 3 days, you'll be able to start running. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to believe this man. And it got to the day before the race, and I still really could hardly walk. And I thought, well, I want to do this thing. I'm just going to go there. All I can do is go and start and just see what happens. But it means committing yourself to 10 days, not changing flights, bringing all your stuff and everything. And in the end, I started this race, and as he said, within a couple of days, everything disappeared. And I still feel that if I hadn't done it, the knee problem might have been a problem for a long time. Somehow, just by addressing this thing, I was able to push through it. And I'm not saying this is the case with everyone, was just purely my own experience. And the curious thing about it was that when I had the problem with the knee, it forced me to move in a completely different way, and it forced me to move my hips differently, it forced me to try a different running gait. And I'm convinced that it was my body persuading me that I needed to somehow change the way I was moving. And I've noticed quite a lot of times before that something will come up and totally stop you in your tracks, but it forces you to assess something about, and it could be dietary, it could be something very personal, sometimes it could be something deeply emotional that you've been carrying around for a long time. Very personal kinds of things, but somehow the injury just seems to force you in this new direction. And I know there's a lot talked about and a lot written about this, but I just wanted to mention that because it's become a big interest for me. And I would just say that if you do have that kind of blockage, just to consider maybe you're actually moving ahead here. This isn't a backward step, but actually something interesting is going on. Because whenever you do all these long distance things, inevitably things come up. And when people come to me and they talk about training, I almost want to say, look, don't worry about that. In about 6 months' time, something's going to happen and you won't actually be able to train. But this is the moment where actually things are really starting to make sense. And just comes back a little bit to what I said about how you feel as if you're engaging with the goal. At some stage you start the training and you feel like, right, this is me now, I'm swimming the channel, I'm just going up and down the pool, but somehow in my head I've started this process of reaching the goal. And that seems to be where something might come up during that process, some kind of little injury, some blockage, something that will just force you onto a different track. And I would just say maybe sometimes have a look and just see if there's something that needs to be changed that might actually really help you. And I found that with the race last year that changing my gait actually enabled me to get through this race in a way that I think if I hadn't had the injury, I wouldn't have done nearly so well, and I'd perhaps got injured during the race. So somehow the injury took me into this other area. So I find that a fascinating area, and actually for me now, one of the reasons why I'm inspired to do these things, to actually try and find out for myself what's going on there. I've always liked Yogi Berra, the New York Yankees baseball player, famous baseball player and coach. But he says, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. And I think there's some great wisdom in that you get to this blockage, but you somehow have to accept it. How do you go about that? Sri Chinmoy says that when your progress is blocked, to at least find some other way. But just keep that idea of moving ahead somehow. The last thing I want to talk about is what on earth is the point? Why do you bother doing this? Why do we do these kinds of things? And I found when I started doing these swims, sometimes a local paper or perhaps local radio, usually arranged by someone else actually, and they'd call me and say, hey, I've got this great interview lined up for you. I'd say, oh, well, I'm kind of busy, I'm not sure if I can do that. But I did start to do some of these interviews and little articles and things, perhaps with a local paper. And the first question would be, well, why do you do this? And why have you done it more than once? And I actually found sometimes I was a little bit tongue-tied. I actually didn't really have an answer. I knew deep within I knew, and there was some reason for it, but I thought, I really need to come up with some answers here. And this is another thing I think is an interesting point. And I'd say another reason why I do these things, perhaps is to try and work out why I do them. That's something I came up with, and I thought it was a great idea on my last run. But why do you do it? Well, the first thing I'd say is, I thought about it, and I don't think it's a selfish activity. I don't think spending this time training and doing these things is a purely selfish endeavor. I think you definitely come out of it fitter and healthier, and you seem to have something that people get from it. You see something rubs off from you when you're in that kind of mood and you're fit and healthy. People seem to get something from it. There's a lot written about the ripple effect, for example, how positive thinking or positive actions in one area sometimes can affect things in other areas. I don't know if that's true or not, but I like the idea of it, and I'd like to perhaps see if it works. You know, almost like go out there. Does it make a difference to someone if I do these things? So I think that would be the first thing. And secondly, I think really just these things give you a tremendous thrill. Is that there's a joy and a happiness that come from these things. And I think it's a joy that we think we're having fun and we're enjoying ourselves, but sometimes I've noticed doing these things, you get a sort of like a childlike thrill. You think, I haven't really had that feeling for years. In fact, I don't remember having that feeling for 10 years or 20 years. And you just suddenly remember inside you is that potential for tremendous happiness sometimes. And that just occasionally just seems to burst forth. And I think would be another reason for me to do these things. trying to think if there was anything else on that point. I think really for me with the channel, it's just the whole symbol for me of the channel is like quite an epic thing. You've got the waves and the tides and the current, and there's a goal. And I found that every time I did it, afterwards I would somehow, something small would change, and it might take 3 months or a year, but something would happen that I could attribute to it. And often challenges would come up, and I'd be able to say, well, actually, that's kind of getting me down, it's getting me stressed, but look, I just managed to do this huge swim and go through those things. And then somehow, okay, it's actually not as hard as I thought. The other hand, I think sometimes things seem to get more difficult and complicated, perhaps because I was a bit stronger and I was able to deal with those things. Again, it's something I was interested in observing, but that would perhaps be another reason for taking on some of these challenges. I think we're getting close to our time, so what I thought we could do to finish, I would like to get some questions from you and a bit of chat, but I thought we could just try a very short meditation exercise, just a couple of minutes, basically a breathing exercise. And I think, again, it just comes back to sports really, where we're having to discipline ourselves, we have to breathe, we have to sometimes do things that are very repetitive and keep going for a long time, whether it's swimming or it's running. I think that's really very similar to meditation. But I thought we'd just do a very quick little breathing exercise, and then hopefully at the end we'll have time for a few questions. So we'll get the audio going. So I'm just going to guide you through a few ideas with your breathing, and there'll be a few images here that you can focus on, or you can just close your eyes and relax if you want to. So just try and sit, relax, but as straight as possible. And just become conscious of your breathing. If you can, just try to breathe in a little bit more deeply than normal. And just try and lengthen your exhalation. And if you can, just try and imagine there's a thread dangling down in front of your nose as you breathe in and out. As you breathe in and out, you're not moving that thread around at all, just very focused on your breathing. Now what I'd like you to do is just try and imagine that the room is filled with peace. There's a peaceful energy. As you breathe in that peace. And then as you breathe out, you just get rid of any anxieties or any stress that you might have. Breathe in peace and just breathe out any stress or anxiety. Next, I'd like you just to imagine you're breathing in energy. Try and imagine this tremendous energy surrounding you. As you breathe that into your system. As you breathe out, again, just breathing out any tiredness, any stress, anything that's bothering you, feel that you're able to get rid of that by breathing in. Just keep concentrating on your breathing. We're going to listen to a couple of aphorisms.
Just silence the mind. Low cosmic energy enters into our entire being, and tremendous energy flows in us and through us. Meditation means the recognition or discovery of one's own true self. Meditation is dynamism on the inner planes of consciousness. Do not use the mind. A child does not use the mind. He just runs and runs. He never becomes tired. Unhorizoned is our inner peace. Like the boundless sky, it encompasses all.
And a lot of this, the energy and the things that have come from meditation, would have been just like a slow build-up, something that sort of slowly seeped into the system somehow. When I look back at these, the way I tried mentally to divide up the distance, I don't really remember myself consciously doing that, just something that seemed to happen. And now looking back, I can see it's very much part of meditation. For trying to do the 6-hour swim, I think I would definitely be, that particular day, trying to just keep things out of my mind, not worry about things too much, and just try to get there, try to make a start without something coming into my mind that enabled me to stop. Because all sorts of things would come up to say, well, you don't have to do it today, you could do it tomorrow, or perhaps you don't need to do it, just to try and put that out of my mind as much as possible. With the channel swim, it would definitely be something that started to build up. Usually I'd find I had this fantastic burning enthusiasm for it until about a week before, when suddenly it would become a reality that this thing is really about to happen. And I think that's where I would just find myself sitting quietly as much as I could, just trying to meditate, just trying to put these thoughts out of my mind that were saying, what's the point, you can't do it. Because no doubt, once you, no matter how big a desire you have to do this thing, how much you've trained, how much money you've spent on this thing, I would find with the channel swim, after about an hour, or maybe even less, I'd be saying to myself, right, I don't want to do this thing, I can't do it, I've got to stop. And the mind would be so powerful, I'd be on the verge of packing the whole thing in. And it didn't care about the money, didn't care about all the people I told about. But somehow, I think the meditation helped me just say, look, okay, I understand the point that you're making, but let's just give it another 5 or 10 minutes and just see how things are. And almost always, if I could get through a couple of hours, everything then would seem fine. There'd just be these points, almost like a fever, really, which is very, very intense. And you think, well, if it's going to be like this for the next 10, 15 hours, then I'd rather be dead. But somehow, very quickly, much more quickly than I would imagine, that would disappear. And you'd just be in this state where you're just in the flow of it, I think, and it doesn't seem so bad. It's still a long way, and you're conscious of how far you have to go, but somehow the mind is just quietened down. And I think that would have come from having done quite a lot of meditation, that the mind was already able to still down a bit quicker. So I think that would be my answer. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, hi. Do you have a daily meditation discipline you usually go through?
Yes, I do. I try to, every morning, try to wake up as early as I can, usually around 6 if I can. It doesn't happen every morning. And I try and do about 15 or 20 minutes, and it's just sitting quietly, it's going through, a bit like what we did with the breathing. And a lot of times I might feel that nothing much has happened. But if I don't do it, then I definitely notice during the day I've missed something. Just as if you perhaps missed your breakfast or something. In fact, Sri Chinmoy once said it's really just like it's a kind of food that you need to take on every day. And you may not eat the most tasty food every day, but you still need to eat to keep alive. And I think for me it's become like that. It's something that just become part of my life. And of course people do spend much longer in deeper meditation. I think probably when I go for these longer swims, that's perhaps what I'm doing to some extent. But I would say even, people often say, well, I don't have time to meditate, and that is understandable. But I think really 5 minutes or 10 minutes of just that sitting in a focused, quiet way can make a big difference. Yeah.